Well, if you were in church this last Sunday and you saw my object lesson, you probably knew this was coming. I want to spend today talking about the man who would become Santa Claus, or as I've titled it, Santa? Maybe? So let's start with where I started on Sunday. We know that the person of Santa Claus is likely, in fact, directly derived from Saint Nicholas, or as he was known in life, Nicholas of Myra, or Mira. Translations and pronunciations change over time. We actually don't know that much about Nicholas. We know for certain that he died on December 6th in the year 343. His birth is estimated to be around March 15th in 270, but the date can sometimes change. We know that at one point he served as Bishop of Myra. There are significant historical legends that say that he was born to wealthy parents who died while he was young, including some historical understandings that he was raised by his uncle, who had no children and who was then a bishop. So Nicholas grew up in this very religious family. This is mostly legend. Interestingly, in the 3rd century, people weren't writing down every fact of their life and posting it on something that automatically gets electronically transmitted to the Library of Congress. Weird, right? So almost everything that we know of Nicholas is legendary. And I don't just mean that the stories are miraculous and a little out there. I mean that they're not historically perfectly recorded. So we have to take quite a lot of it with a grain of salt. One of these, and unfortunately it's one of my favorite stories, is this story that Nicholas was present at the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, or CE, at which they were debating the divinity of Christ. Arius, who you can see just on my side right here in the black cap, was claiming that Christ could not have been fully divine and co-equal with God the Father, and Nicholas, the man who would be Santa, hauled off and slapped him. There's no real proof that Nicholas was present at the council, although if he had been a bishop at that point, there would be good reason to invite him, and there's no real proof that he hit Arius, although he might have wanted to. The divinity of Christ was a big deal back then about how we were going to understand how exactly it was that God had come to earth, and so the idea of hauling off and slapping somebody who disagreed that Jesus was co-equal with the Father, not entirely outside the realm of possibility, especially when you consider that most of the other legends about Nicholas were that he was extremely faithful, miraculously powerful, and generous. You have to be pretty bad to make that guy mad. There are other miraculous stories, again, all of them being legendary, about St. Nicholas. In particular, Nicholas is remembered not as a patron saint of a lot of different things, but especially sailors. The story that gets attributed to is that Nicholas, either, depending on the legend, when he was alive or after he had died, helped calm a storm that was threatening to swamp a boat that he was either traveling in when he was alive or summoned to once he was dead. So we have this story in which Nicholas saves sailors while at sea. You can see him in the center of this image here. He's got a slightly balding head, a white beard, and the traditional white stole with 2 broad crosses on the top of his shoulders. You can also see in this photo that he's beginning to wear red. There are other legends around St. Nicholas, or the man who would become St. Nicholas, in particular that he was so devout that after becoming bishop he would travel around the countryside tearing down altars to false idols, to other gods besides, you know, the god. In particular, he was interested in taking down places that appeared to become demon-possessed because they had been used as sites of idol worship, one of these being a cypress tree. The demons were continually coming out of the tree and harassing citizens of a nearby village, and so Nicholas cast them out, Nicholas exorcised them by brandishing an axe. I'm not entirely certain why he could do it and nobody else with an axe could, but the legend has it that he was able to cast out the demons and protect the people of the village. In other miraculous things attributed to Nicholas of Myra that I did not include in the children's message this Sunday is the story of the 3 pickled boys. In this one, a butcher in either a city which Nicholas visited or in Myra where he was bishop killed and pickled 3 young boys. It's unknown if this was just a really bloodthirsty butcher, if he needed extra meat. Some stories say that he was planning to sell the dead children as ham, or if his wife put him up to it, because if you can put a woman in the story, it's good to blame her for whatever went wrong. No matter what, there were 3 boys, and they had been killed and then put into pickle barrels to be dealt with later, I guess. But Nicholas was able to see through the butcher's terrible act and not only find him and accuse him and find the 3 barrels, but also to raise the 3 boys back to life. Again, this one is a little miraculous and likely not entirely based in fact. The one that we most often hear attributed to Nicholas of Myra, and the one that has perhaps the most grain of truth to it, is the story of the way he took care of 3 poor girls. Again, the story moves from either Myra or to a nearby town where Nicholas might have visited, but the core of the story is that there were 3 young women, unmarried and living with their father, whose father did not have enough money to pay them a dowry. In different stories, it varies a little bit on exactly what that meant for them. In some, it meant they might have to become employed in what we would consider undesirable ways, not because they got to choose it, but because that was the only way they could make money, or that they would be married off unfavorably to less than choice partners. Essentially, this father and his 3 girls were stuck. Nicholas heard about their problem and would leave anonymous gifts of money. The story varies. Most likely we know that he gave them some amount of money and that he tried to do it anonymously. The story varies whether he did it all at once, or one night after another, or once every year as the girls became of marriageable age. But essentially, we know that the story is that this wealthy bishop brought a gift to a family in need and tried to do it anonymously. Whether it's become a story that comes to life because someone in Nicholas's life knew about it, or because, as the legend goes, the father stays up on the 3rd night to try to catch him in the act, is up for debate. But this is also where we get the story, or supposedly, where we get the story of why we hang stockings by the fireplace. Because the father stayed up on the 3rd night to watch and see who this was who was distributing money to himself and his 3 daughters, Nicholas had to find a different way to distribute the money rather than just sneaking it into their house. He threw it through a window towards the only lighted place in the house that he could see, a fire. Next to the fire, the girls had been drying their washing, including stockings, and the gold from Nicholas fell into the stockings. Thus, we hang stockings by the tree at Christmas. You know that I'm telling this as an understanding that that part is most likely legendary, right? Good. The most important thing about Nicholas's legacy was this idea of anonymous gift-giving, and in a lot of traditions, they understand that even after Nicholas had died, there continued to be this practice of anonymous gift-giving in Myra and in other cities that he cared for, where people would give to each other, especially to those in need, without letting anyone know who the gift-giver was. They would often attribute the gifts to Saint Nicholas, even after he had died. Because Nicholas was not only the patron saint of children, having saved those 3 kids from the pickle barrels, but also the patron saint of travelers, his story ends up spreading throughout Europe. But of course, his story ends up meeting up with and getting mixed up with some existing stories, in particular, the story of Odin, a god in Norse mythology, so in Germanic and Nordic countries, that goes back to the 1st century. And Odin, well, Odin's big feast day is around the winter solstice, or Yule as it's known in Norse mythology, which happens to be only 15 days away from the feast of St. Nicholas on his death day, December 6th. In addition, we get in Odin someone who flies around the country on an 8-legged horse. You can see the horse here has normal horse legs that then split into 2 feet towards the end of the leg, and that Odin distributes gifts to good children. As the Santa Claus mythology, or as the St. Nicholas mythology continues to permeate throughout Europe, with children receiving gifts on or around December 6th, and sailors also celebrating on that feast day their safe return home, we start finding other interesting traditions and the way that this story morphs over 1,200 years. By the time we reach the German Protestant Reformation, however, it's time to get rid of St. Nicholas. Sometimes this action is attributed to Martin Luther. I haven't found anything that can concretely prove that, but Luther did tend to get a bit antagonistic, so we can blame things on him if we want. But essentially what happened was that St. Nicholas, again being a Catholic saint, had become this revered part of the Christmas celebration, and Luther or other Protestants in Germany wanted to get rid of any association with anything that was outside of what they really were certain was true, which was what they found in scripture and what they worked out through logic and reason. Since the legend of St. Nicholas could not be worked out through logic and reason and didn't exist in the Bible, they had to get rid of him entirely. Instead, they focused on bringing gifts not on December 6th, but at Christmas on December 25th, when the Christ child was said to bring the gifts, the Christkindl. However, someone quickly pointed out that children don't have a lot of carrying capacity, and so suddenly you get someone accompanying the child, the Christ child, to deliver these gifts. Interestingly, this person is still dressed in furs and is long white bearded and distributes gifts to those in need. He's sometimes called Ruklaus, or Rough Claus, Aschenclaus, or Ashy Claus, or Pelsnickel, Furry Claus. I don't really know how that last one translates. My German's very bad. At the same time, or just a little later, over in England in the 16th century, we get the development and rise of Father Christmas. And Father Christmas, pre the Victorian era, was this embodiment of the merriment and drinking and food associated with Christmas. If you think of, for example, the very popular Christmas story, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, Father Christmas is usually associated with the ghost of Christmas present, the jolly old long-bearded man dressed in fur who sprinkles his torch of joy and glee everywhere he goes, celebrating with people who are coming together to eat, drink, and be merry. During the Victorian era, however, Father Christmas transitioned from someone who celebrated with drink and food, obviously way too gluttonous for the Victorians, and moved into something that was family-based, focused on bringing gifts to children. Of course, with all of this, we also have to mention that throughout Central Europe, we had the development of Krampus, the accompaniment to St. Nicholas or to his other deviations that leaves sticks or sometimes takes bad children. Krampus has some really dark backstory, but essentially it all comes down to that whole morality thing about you punish the bad kids and you reward the good, and let's make St. Nicholas really, really good by making him never have to dole out punishments and instead giving it off to this half-goat, half-man named Krampus. So throughout Europe, we have these developments of Christmas traditions around some bearded, white-haired man who brings gifts and cares for those who have been good this year. And what happens next? So many of those countries begin emigration patterns to America. Now, America, I don't know if you've noticed this, doesn't always handle a lack of binaries well. We like things to fit pretty nicely into boxes, and we don't like it when there's multiple different immigrant traditions that keep functioning. Especially didn't like that in the 1800s when we wanted America to act like a melting pot, where everybody shed their immigrant identities from their father and mother countries and instead became quote-unquote American. So what happens here? We start getting a lot of blending of these European traditions about this man, St. Nicholas, about some of the myths and theologies around Odin, and around the other accompaniments to the Christ child and the Father Christmas myths, and we start getting what will become Santa Claus. Washington Irving, a popular writer in New York, wrote The Knickerbocker's History of New York in 1809, and this is the first place in American tradition where we get the idea of St. Nicholas, still St. Nicholas, designed as a pipe-smoking person drawing a flying wagon which soars over rooftops to deliver presents to good children and sticks witches to bad ones, the forerunner of the delivery of coal. It's in 1823 that Clement Clark Moore develops the idea of Santa Claus, still not calling him Santa Claus. In this story, it's a visit of St. Nicholas, or as you and I know it, 'twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. When Moore penned this in 1823, he concretized a lot of the concepts flying around about this figure of St. Nicholas who came at or around Christmas. But he added some additional things that had not been quite written down or established yet. Some of the questions around whether or not St. Nicholas got into the house through a chimney were now resolved. He definitely did. St. Nicholas went from being tall and skinny into plump, was definitely decided as dressed in fur, and interestingly, St. Nicholas was described as flying a miniature sleigh with 8 tiny reindeer. All those reindeer were named, which was entirely new, and the inclusion of 8 reindeer was new. 1 reindeer, or a horse or a donkey, had been present in previous myths, but Moore's the one who made it 8. Additionally, Santa in The Night Before Christmas, or excuse me, St. Nicholas, because again, the name Santa Claus is not yet in function. St. Nicholas in 'Twas the Night Before Christmas is described as flying a miniature sleigh with 8 tiny reindeer and is described as a right jolly old elf, suggesting that St. Nicholas would have been small, which makes sense for somebody who's got to make it down the chimney. We don't get a plump St. Nicholas until 1862. With Thomas Nast, who was drawing for Harper's. He began making illustrations of the man who would be Santa and displaying him as human, wearing white and red fur or velvet, also living at the North Pole, which makes sense if you need somebody to live where there's Christmas all year round. This is also where St. Nicholas begins receiving letters asking for gifts, where St. Nicholas is equipped with a whole workshop full of elves and the list of children that are naughty and nice. 1862, that's how far back that goes. The inclusion of the naughty and nice list and the existence of elves is only just barely over 150 years old. It's kind of wild to think that one person writing a poem and one person drawing some illustrations can completely shape a mythos that now rules every single shopping mall in America. Well, not this year, but rules every single shopping mall in America in a non-pandemic year. But if you think about it, population-wise, we're currently over 300 million people in the United States, but in 1862, we were barely cresting 30 million, and a good number of those weren't going to school, reading or writing, were working in a lot of industrial and other situational factory or widespread work. We had only a certain amount of media to consume. We definitely did not have 24/7 coverage on television, radio, or, brace yourselves, we didn't even have Netflix. So the mythos of Santa was pretty easy to get into the concept of American mythology. It's important to note that Santa in 1862 already has that red suit. Some people like to attribute the Santa's red suit to Coca-Cola, turning him into a white and red recreation of their own label. But Coke only capitalized on the already existing white and red patterns in Santa's costume. Coke, however, did export Santa into almost every other country in the world, because where the money can go, there went the advertising. So Santa was then exported from America into every country in the world that Coke could sell its products. Turns out, there's a lot of money to be made in hawking stuff at Christmas. The Santa myth has continued to evolve in American culture, including the 1939 publication of the first version of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. This was published as a coloring book for Montgomery Ward, one of the major department stores in Chicago. In 1939, 10 years after the beginning of the Depression, they were already giving out free coloring books to children at Christmas, and this was a story that was particularly commissioned. Rudolph's red nose, interestingly, is inspired by the fog in Chicago coming off Lake Michigan. The illustrator and writer who was creating the story was thinking and could not figure out how to tell a story for Christmas until the fog passed by his skyscraper window, and he came up with the idea of a 9th reindeer whose unusual nose would be bright enough to light the way. Don't worry, the Santa myth didn't stop evolving in 1939. We're still adding to it with my least favorite part of the retail season, the elf on the shelf. And I'm not saying that just because I don't know that we need to turn everything about our lives in America into the morality police for children, but mostly because it just reminds me of my years working at Barnes & Noble. Customer service during Christmas time, I mean, it'll turn you into a Calvinist and convince you of total depravity of humanity, that's for certain. But the elf on the shelf was introduced in 2005 by a new author, Carol Abersfeld and Chandra Bell, and has now become a family tradition in many households over the past 15 years. The Santa mythos has continued developing throughout America in so many different media facets, in so many different ways. We think of Santa as entirely tied up with Christmas, even though, from a religious standpoint, the concept that we have of Santa now is pretty far separated from it. So our meditation question for this evening has to be, what is still worth telling about the story of Santa? Unsurprisingly, there's not that many hymns about St. Nicholas, so we're going to wind it up with Santa Claus is Coming to Town by the Jackson 5.